The bird that knew too much. It was late in the autumn when Eleanor first heard the bird. The wind had picked up, and the trees around her cottage had started shedding their leaves in droves, but it was the sound of the bird that disturbed the peaceful rhythm of the countryside. The persistent, eerie cry of a crow echoed through the cold air every evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. At first, she thought nothing of it. The area was full of birds, especially crows, whose calls were a regular backdrop to her solitary life. Eleanor had moved to the isolated cottage after a painful breakup, seeking solace in nature's quiet embrace. She had always loved the countryside, its simplicity and isolation providing the perfect refuge. But soon, she found herself growing uneasy with the bird's presence. It wasn't just its sound, it was the timing. The bird seemed to call every evening at precisely 6:13 p.m. Each night, as the clock struck, its cry would pierce the silence, setting her on edge. One evening, after weeks of enduring the noise, Eleanor decided to investigate. She stood on her porch, staring into the darkening forest where she assumed the bird must be. The light from her lantern flickered in the growing darkness as the wind howled through the trees. And then, there it was again. The sharp, throaty call of the crow, so loud and close it made her jump. She walked toward the tree line, the cold air biting at her skin, but as she approached, the sound stopped abruptly. The forest was eerily silent. Eleanor stood in the clearing, peering into the blackness beyond the trees, feeling an unsettling chill that had nothing to do with the wind. The hairs on her neck stood up, and for the first time since moving to the cottage, she felt truly afraid. As she was about to turn back, she saw it, a shadow flitting between the branches, a large crow perched on the lowest limb of an ancient oak. Its beady eyes locked onto hers, unblinking, as if it had been waiting for her all along. The crow's figure seemed unnatural, larger than any bird she had ever seen, its feathers unnaturally glossy, almost shimmering in the dim moonlight. The creature looked as if it didn't belong in the world of living things. But there was something wrong. The bird's eyes gleamed with an intelligence that sent a chill crawling down her spine. It wasn't like the empty, instinctive gaze of a normal animal. This bird was watching her as though it understood something deeply hidden, something ancient. For a moment, Eleanor felt as though the bird wasn't just looking at her. It was reading her thoughts, peering into the darkest corners of her mind. Then, in a voice that sent a shiver through her very soul, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." Eleanor staggered backward, her breath coming in short gasps. The crow's words were like a cold hand grabbing her heart. She had heard stories of talking animals, legends passed down in hushed tones. But this wasn't a story. This was real. The bird didn't move. It just stared at her, waiting for her to respond. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. The crow tilted its head, as if considering her words. Then it spoke again, its voice harsh and raspy, like a whisper carried on the wind. "You're not supposed to know what's hidden here." Eleanor's mind raced. What was the bird talking about? What was hidden here? The cottage had been abandoned for years before she moved in. She had chosen it because it seemed peaceful, untouched by the world. But now, standing beneath the twisted oak, she wondered if there was something she had missed, something that the bird was trying to warn her about. Before she could respond, the bird let out a sharp caw and took flight, its wings cutting through the air like the wind itself. Eleanor stood frozen, the chill of the forest creeping into her bones. Her heart pounded as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. But then, as if guided by an unseen hand, her eyes were drawn to the ground beneath the oak tree. There, partially buried in the earth, was something she hadn't noticed before, an old, weathered wooden box, half rotted and covered in moss. Eleanor bent down to examine it, her fingers brushing the damp wood. It seemed like any other forgotten object, lost to time. But as soon as her fingers made contact, a cold jolt of electricity shot through her body, and she gasped, pulling her hand away. It was as if the box itself was alive, pulsing with a dark energy. The crow's voice echoed in her mind again. "You don't know what you've uncovered." Ignoring the warning, Eleanor dug at the box, desperate to see what lay inside. It took several minutes of frantic scraping, but finally, the box came loose. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside was an old yellowed piece of paper, covered in strange symbols and markings she didn't recognize. The paper was fragile, like it had been untouched for centuries, but the symbols on it glowed faintly, as if imbued with some otherworldly power. There was also a small, twisted piece of bone, shaped like a key, and a vial of black liquid that looked as if it had been preserved for centuries. The vial's surface was slick with moisture, and the liquid inside shifted as though it had a life of its own. The air around her seemed to thicken, the forest closing in, pressing against her. She could feel the weight of the silence settling over the land, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Eleanor's breath became shallow, her chest tight with fear, as if the very atmosphere was conspiring to choke her. Her mind raced as she stared at the vial, the key, and the paper. The symbols made her uneasy, but something deep inside her, something dark and buried, compelled her to hold on to them. The crow's voice returned, but this time it was louder, sharper, as if coming not just from the bird, but from the very earth beneath her feet. "You've unlocked the curse." The sky above her seemed to darken, the moon hidden behind a mass of clouds that moved unnaturally fast. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees, and the leaves swirled around her feet. Eleanor stumbled back, clutching the box to her chest, but the figure of the crow remained unmoving, watching her. She turned to run, but before she could take a step, the ground beneath her trembled as though it was shifting, groaning with a deep, ancient hunger. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the doorway of her cottage. It was tall and gaunt, its face hidden by a hood. Its presence seemed to suck the air from the room, leaving Eleanor gasping for breath. The shadows in the corners of the cottage stretched unnaturally long, and the air grew thick, suffocating. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees in an instant, frost creeping along the walls. The figure stepped forward, its hooded face obscured by darkness, but its eyes, glowing red, seemed to pierce through the shadows, locking onto hers with a terrifying gaze. The crow's cry echoed again, but this time it was followed by something far worse: footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, as if something, or someone, was approaching from inside the house. The very structure of the cottage seemed to groan in protest, as though it too was alive, reacting to whatever force had been awakened. Eleanor's heart raced. She spun around, eyes frantically searching for an escape, but there was no way out. "Leave now before it's too late." The crow's voice rang out once more, but it was no longer the bird's voice. It was deeper now, more sinister, coming from the figure in the doorway. Eleanor staggered backward, her mind spinning. The figure advanced, moving like a shadow, its footsteps silent on the floorboards. Her vision blurred, but she could see the black liquid from the vial swirling in her mind, and the symbols on the paper seemed to grow brighter with each passing moment. "Now you belong to the darkness," the figure whispered, its voice like the wind itself. The darkness in the room grew thicker, and the walls seemed to close in. The shadows wrapped themselves around Eleanor like cold, unyielding hands, suffocating her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if her voice had been stolen from her, swallowed by the growing storm of darkness. The crow's cry echoed louder now, its voice a cacophony of torment, like the last breath of the living. The figure reached out, its long fingers brushing against Eleanor's cheek, sending a jolt of icy cold through her entire body. And then, in a final moment of terror, the floor beneath her feet cracked open, and she was dragged into the abyss below. The cottage stood empty, the door swinging open on its own, as the wind howled through the trees. The crow perched on the branch of the ancient oak, its beady eyes watching, waiting, as the cursed house remained in its eerie silence. Eleanor was never seen again. But the bird? The bird still comes every evening at 6:13 p.m., its cries a warning to anyone who dares uncover what was never meant to be found. The curse remains, and it's waiting for the next soul to awaken it. The haunting of the house sitter. Mia had always been the reliable one. A college student working part-time, she was always looking for ways to make extra money. When her friend Emma mentioned a house-sitting opportunity in the quiet town of Pinewood, Mia eagerly accepted. The family was going on vacation, and all she had to do was look after the house, feed the cat, and make sure everything was locked up at night. The house was enormous, perched on a hill at the edge of the town, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the sky. As Mia drove up, the house looked even more imposing than she had imagined. Its windows stared down like cold, unblinking eyes, and the ivy crawling up its stone walls gave it an ancient, forgotten feel. Inside, the house was dark and silent, save for the soft hum of an old refrigerator in the kitchen. The air smelled musty, like it hadn't been lived in for years. The furniture was heavy and old, and the walls were lined with portraits of long-dead ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her as she moved through the rooms. Mia shrugged off the uneasy feeling. She had a job to do, and she wasn't about to let a little discomfort ruin her time. After settling in, she fed the cat, a sleek black creature with unnaturally bright green eyes, and retired to the guest room on the second floor. The house settled into an eerie quiet as the night wore on. Mia tried to ignore the strange creaks and groans of the old building. Every now and then, she thought she heard footsteps overhead, but when she checked, there was no one there. It was when she was in the kitchen late at night that she heard the first unmistakable sound, a faint tapping, like someone knocking gently on a door. Mia froze, looking around. The sound was coming from upstairs. Hesitantly, she went to the staircase and listened. The tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, as though someone was trying to get her attention. It stopped as soon as she reached the second floor. Mia's heart raced. She told herself it was just the house settling, but a growing sense of dread made it hard to shake the feeling that she was being watched. The cat appeared at the top of the stairs, its glowing eyes locking onto hers. It stared for a long moment before slowly walking away, vanishing into the shadows. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Mia lay in the guest room, her eyes flicking to the door that led into the hall. The house felt like it was breathing around her, groaning, creaking, shifting. She heard the tapping again, this time louder, as though someone was knocking on her door. The next morning, Mia tried to brush off the events of the night before. It was just her imagination, she thought. But as the day wore on, things grew stranger. Doors that she was sure she had closed were open when she returned. The cat would stare at her from dark corners, its eyes glowing eerily. When she went into the basement to fetch some firewood, she found an old, dusty mirror leaning against the wall. The glass was cloudy, and the frame was intricately carved with symbols she didn't recognize. As Mia stepped closer, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She felt a cold hand on her shoulder, and when she turned around, no one was there. She looked into the mirror again. This time, the reflection wasn't quite right. In the corner of the glass, there was a shadowy figure standing just behind her. Its face was obscured, but its eyes, those same glowing green eyes, locked onto hers. Mia stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. The house seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, and the whispering started. Soft, almost imperceptible voices filled the air, and Mia could make out words like leave and help, pleas for escape. By nightfall, she was certain the house was alive, that it was keeping her there, trapping her. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker. The cat appeared again, its eyes glowing bright in the hallway, staring at her as if waiting for something. Mia bolted toward the front door, but the handle wouldn't turn. She tugged and pulled, but the door was locked from the inside. Panic set in as the walls seemed to close in around her. She ran to the attic, convinced there had to be something there, some way to escape this nightmare. The attic door creaked open, revealing a room filled with old trunks and broken furniture. In the center of the room stood a pedestal with a small, ornate box resting on top of it. Mia approached the box with trembling hands. As she reached for it, a cold, skeletal hand shot out from the shadows, gripping her wrist. She screamed, but no sound came out. The shadowy figure, its glowing green eyes now piercing into her soul, towered over her. The box snapped open on its own, releasing a gust of wind that knocked Mia to the ground. The house shook violently, groaning as though it were in pain. The shadows lunged at her, and everything went black. When Mia woke, the house was silent. The oppressive darkness was gone, and the front door was wide open. She ran outside into the cool night air, gasping for breath, but when she looked back, the house stood motionless, its windows dark. Mia never returned to Pinewood. She couldn't explain what had happened, but she knew that something in that house had changed her, something that would never let her go. She heard the whispers in her dreams, felt the cold hand on her shoulder when no one was there. And sometimes, just before she fell asleep, she would catch a glimpse of the cat's glowing eyes, watching her from the corner of her room. The stranger in the house. Clara had always been a skeptic, the kind of person who didn't believe in ghosts, superstitions, or anything that couldn't be explained by logic. So when she found the old house on the outskirts of town, she wasn't looking for a haunted history. She was simply looking for a new start. After a painful breakup and the end of her job in the city, she needed somewhere quiet to think, to heal. The house was perfect, isolated, a bit run down, but full of character. The house stood at the end of a long, winding road, surrounded by overgrown trees. It was a 2-story Victorian mansion, its paint peeling and the roof covered in moss. But Clara didn't mind. It felt like a place she could reinvent herself. Her first few days were peaceful. The house creaked and groaned with age, but nothing unusual happened. She spent her time cleaning, organizing, and enjoying the silence. But on the 4th night, things changed. It started with the sound of footsteps. At first, Clara dismissed them, thinking it was just the house settling. But as the nights passed, the footsteps grew more distinct, more deliberate. They were slow, heavy, as if someone was pacing the hallways just outside her bedroom. Clara would wake in the middle of the night, heart racing. But when she checked, the house was empty, as silent as it had been before. One evening, after hearing the footsteps again, Clara decided to investigate. She grabbed a flashlight and crept down the stairs, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The house felt colder than usual, and the air seemed thicker, like it was pressing in on her. She walked down the hallway, her flashlight flickering as she approached the source of the sound, the living room. The room was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the fireplace. Clara's heart thudded in her chest. She felt something, or someone, was in the room with her. She turned the corner slowly, holding her breath, but the room was empty. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if they were moving on their own. Suddenly, a low voice echoed from the corner, just out of sight. "You shouldn't be here." Clara froze, the blood draining from her face. She wasn't sure whether she had heard it, or if it was just the wind, but the words felt too real, too close. With a sudden burst of courage, Clara rushed to the back door and flung it open, hoping the fresh air would clear her mind. But as she stepped outside, she froze again. Standing in the yard, just outside the door, was a man. Tall, thin, wearing a dark coat, his face obscured by the shadows. He didn't move. He didn't say anything. He just stared at her, his eyes gleaming faintly in the dark. Clara stumbled back, slamming the door shut behind her. She didn't know what to make of the stranger. Maybe he was a drifter, someone who had gotten lost. But the feeling of dread in her gut told her otherwise. The man wasn't just a stranger. He was something more, something darker. The following days became a blur of paranoia and fear. Clara could no longer ignore the unsettling feeling that she was being watched. Every time she turned a corner, every time she looked out a window, she expected to see him standing just beyond the reach of the light. But he was always gone by the time she checked. The footsteps continued, now always following her wherever she went in the house. Sometimes the door would creak open by itself, or the lights would flicker. Every night, the whispers grew louder, a constant murmur that made Clara's skin crawl. She stopped sleeping, terrified of what might happen if she let her guard down. But no matter how much she searched the house, she could never find the source of the noises. One night, Clara was sitting in the kitchen, trying to calm her nerves with a cup of tea. The silence in the house was oppressive, and the darkness outside the window seemed to press closer. That's when she heard it again, the slow, deliberate footsteps, but this time they were coming from the attic. The attic. Clara had avoided it since moving in. It was locked, and she hadn't bothered to investigate, thinking it was just full of old junk. But now, the door was wide open. The cold air seemed to rush down the stairs as Clara approached, her heart hammering. She grabbed a broom from the closet and slowly ascended the stairs to the attic. The wooden steps creaked beneath her weight, each sound amplified in the silence. At the top of the stairs, the attic was pitch black. Clara's flashlight flickered as she stepped into the room, and she immediately felt the temperature drop. The air was stale, suffocating. She shone the beam across the room, scanning the forgotten trunks and boxes. And then, she saw him, the stranger. He was standing in the farthest corner of the attic, his back to her. His dark coat was tattered, his face still hidden in shadow. Clara's breath caught in her throat as he slowly turned to face her. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Clara backed away, but she couldn't take her eyes off him. He was still, unmoving, but she could feel his presence pressing in on her, suffocating her. "You're not real," Clara whispered, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. The man didn't reply. Instead, he stepped forward, his movements jerky, unnatural, as if his body was being controlled by something else. Clara's flashlight died, plunging her into darkness. She reached for the stairs, but the floor beneath her feet seemed to shift, like it was moving, warping. In the distance, she could hear the man's voice again, softer now, like it was coming from everywhere at once. "You shouldn't have stayed." The floor gave way beneath her, and Clara fell into the blackness. When she hit the ground, the world spun, and the last thing she heard was the whisper of the man's voice, now unmistakable in the cold, empty silence. "You are mine now." The next morning, the house stood silent. No footsteps echoed through the halls, no whispers lingered in the air. The attic door was locked, and the yard was empty. Clara was gone, and the stranger in the house remained, waiting for the next lost soul to arrive. And the house was never empty again.